Hi, I'm David Lax, co-founder and managing director of Lax Sebanius LLC. On behalf of Lax Sebanius LLC, I'm delighted that you've chosen to attend the second of our series of webinars on social media and negotiation. This session will be comprised of a 30-minute presentation and 30 minutes of questions and answers. Now, not all of you know Lax Sebanius LLC. Briefly, we're a consulting firm that advises companies and governments in complex and high-stakes negotiations. We also build our clients' capabilities as organizations to get consistently better results in certain classes of negotiations. Now, some of the Lax Sebanius team, Jim Sebanius, Isaac Silberberg, and Paul Levy, will be on today's Zoom call. Others, like Ron Fortgang, Ben Cook, Shanaz Thompson, and Sarah Kuzik, are on the call but are not going to be participating directly. Now, underlying all of our advisory engagements and capability building is an approach called 3D negotiation that Jim Sebanius and I developed, going back and forth between our academic roles as professors at Harvard Business School and our roles as investment bankers in private equity and as advisors to companies and governments around the world in a range of negotiations from commercial to corporate to legal to governmental and diplomatic negotiations. We find that 3D negotiation is the most sophisticated approach available for thinking about complex negotiations and developing a strategy. And it's that sophistication that makes it exciting and easy to do what we're going to do here today. We've observed that over the last 10 years, digital media has disrupted everything about business. It's changed marketing and sales, business strategy, procurement, how organizations learn, how they serve customers, how they relate to government. Indeed, it's been a major change. However, what we've also seen, looking at our clients and other companies involved in negotiations, and looking at what academics write and what business professionals write, that one field that hasn't yet changed is negotiation strategy. So although digital media has in fact changed negotiations, it hasn't changed the way people think about negotiation strategy. And that's the purpose of this series of webinars. What we see as an important breakthrough is to extend the tools and capabilities of 3D negotiation by using social network analysis and social media generally. And it's in that context that I'm going to ask my colleague James Sebanius to take over and give you a general sense of where we are, recap the first webinar that we had, and put things in context. He'll then turn it over to Isaac Silberberg, who's going to talk about a negotiation between a major Boston area hospital and a union, and he'll take you through that. We're very fortunate that one of Lax Sebanius' team members is Paul Levy, who was, at the time of this case, the CEO of that hospital. And so Paul will join the call and offer some observations and be available for questions and answers. Thanks very much. Take it away, Jim.
Thanks to all of you for joining us today. We're just delighted to be able to share this really interesting work, at least in negotiation, kind of a new frontier that turbocharges traditional tools of negotiation. My job is to very briefly recap what the overall understanding that we've developed about how social media can improve your effectiveness in negotiation. And so I'm going to do that, sharing my screen and making sure that we can see all this. This starts from an observation that neither scholars nor experienced practitioners seem to have a very good handle on how to use social media effectively and ethically as part of negotiation strategy and tactics. And as a result, after talking to lots of people on both sides of the theorist-practitioner divide, we assembled a panel of top academics and really senior practitioners on this topic at a May 2020 Harvard Research Conference on AI, tech, and negotiation. And that's really the intellectual foundations of the advisory practice that we've developed using these new tools. We presented one detailed case study in part one of this webinar series back on August 27th. And if you'd like to see a recording of it, it's frankly fascinating. You can look on negotiate.com where the recording is up. To recap very, very briefly the overall findings within which today's case should be understood. Social media is not just Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram, but many social media platforms exist, and they've got valuable open source data. There are a lot of general tools available to analyze that data, but frankly, not yet customized to meet the needs of sophisticated negotiators. So we've been developing those customized and bespoke tools to help with that practice. What we found is that these tools can enhance your negotiation strategy and tactics in at least 4 ways. It'll help you learn, help you influence, and help mobilize supporters and neutralize potential opponents. These all function to help you reach your target goal in a manner that respects ethical and privacy concerns, which are naturally key. Just a few words on each of these major ways that social media can enhance your strategy and tactics. First, it can help you explore and learn much more about the parties to a negotiation, who they are, actual and potential, who is directly and indirectly influential. What are their interests, their no-deal options or BATNAs, the relationships, formal and informal, as well as possible coalitions. And that learning function, that's something you always do in negotiation, but it turns out that you can do it very effectively and very efficiently by the judicious use of social media. The second major way that social media can boost your odds of reaching a target deal is to wield more effective influence, both directly, how to anticipate their likely points, to frame messages that will resonate and avoid those that will backfire, as well as indirectly, to communicate by other respected sources that can sway the more directly involved parties. And that influence is a second normal function of negotiation that can be greatly enhanced by the proper use of social media. And finally, sometimes you need to mobilize potential supporters and or deter and neutralize opponents of your deal. And social media can be effective in doing that. One thing that we saw in our last seminar is how Amazon actually failed on these 2 counts. And we'll see something very different today. So when we put these together, I'd like you to keep in mind that these help you learn, influence, mobilize, and or neutralize mobilize supporters and or neutralize potential opponents to help you reach your target deal in a way that's ethical and respecting of privacy. Now, our last seminar, in the very briefest summary, detailed how a small band of digerati using social media effectively formed a hostile blocking coalition that derailed Amazon's plans for a New York headquarters. And the puzzle that I think we resolved is how this happened despite the ardent support by Governor Cuomo, Mayor de Blasio, and over 70% of the city's residents, including unions and other civic groups and so forth. Now, we showed how digital tools and open source data from social media could have helped Amazon learn about and influence events both before they happened and in real time during what could have been a productive negotiation. And this included spotting parties with almost no interest and parties who ended up with major impacts on the outcome. And to the right side of my screen, you can see one of a number of social media graphs that unpacked and revealed elements of the negotiation that were frankly invisible until it was too late for the protagonists. And of course, it's one thing to diagnose a problem, but I think the real contribution is to show how using these tools could have mobilized supporters and neutralized opponents to produce a negotiated outcome in New York that frankly would have been great for virtually all the stakeholders. So that's what we did in our last seminar. Today, we're going to focus on a medium-sized hospital in a tough union organizing negotiation. And soon we're going to move to a much smaller entity dealing with a potentially fatal local controversy, fatal being to the business, not to anybody's health or life. And as we develop more advisory experience and more case studies, we may we may extend this seminar series. I'd like to remind you to put any questions or comments in Zoom's Q&A feature. And thanks again for joining us. Let me turn it over to Isaac Silberberg to actually present and analyze today's case.
Thank you so much, Jim. If you'd all just bear with me for a moment while I share my screen. Hi, I'm Isaac Silberberg, a Vice President at Levy. Next, we're going to be taking a look at a case with Paul Levy, who's here with us today. Paul Levy, as CEO of a hospital, was able to use his personal blog, titled Running a Hospital, to fend off a well-financed, multi-year corporate campaign launched by the SEIU to unionize the hospital he led. Paul's success teaches several lessons we think are relevant to understanding the impact of social media on negotiation. First, let's set the stage. In 2005, Paul Levy was CEO of Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, also known as Beth Israel, BIDMC, or BI. Paul had previously worked in state government and the healthcare space as an administrative dean at Harvard Medical School. He was brought in as part of a turnaround effort, as Beth Israel had completed a merger and the resulting challenges resulted in large operating losses for the combined entity. Paul brought a philosophy of radical transparency to his work and started a blog to better communicate with members of BIDMC. His readership grew to over 10,000 regular readers, both inside and outside the hospital, and he gained a lot of trust with his readers by posting about sensitive personal topics, such as operational difficulties and even his personal compensation. BIDMC had just stabilized when the Service Employees International Union, or SEIU, merged with a local union and announced that they would be targeting Boston's top teaching hospitals. Beth Israel was an obvious target for the SEIU. It was in a stable, but not strong financial position, was a teaching hospital for Harvard Medical School, and had strong ties to the Jewish community, which had a lengthy tradition of supporting unions and other progressive causes. Paul, a leader who was not at all opposed to unions, set out to determine the potential effects of unionization for BI and its patients. In addition to expected impacts, such as more rigid work rules for staff and additional processes and restrictions that might harm morale, Paul had specific concerns based on Beth Israel's status as a teaching hospital, where creativity and flexibility were highly valued, and the experiences other institutions had with union organizing efforts. In particular, Paul was wary of Yale New Haven's experience. Another significant teaching hospital, Yale New Haven, had aimed to build a new cancer treatment wing. As part of a corporate campaign to force unionization at that hospital, organized labor had influenced city government as well as state regulatory agencies to impede the construction of this crucial expansion for the hospital's mission, unless the hospital acquiesced to the union's demands. For the purposes of this exercise, we won't be relitigating Paul's research and deliberations, but we'll take it as given that Paul decided unionizing of staff at BIDMC wouldn't be in the best interest of patients or of the hospital. The SEIU was a formidable organization. It had an annual organizing budget of $20 million and over 200 staff just in Massachusetts. How was Paul, armed with his blog and no budget, able to thwart such a well-equipped organization? It's important to take a moment and understand how unions are recognized. The primary way is for unions to hold an election. Managers and workers have the opportunity to discuss the merits of a union, and employees can then vote in a secret ballot election to determine if they wish to be represented by a union. However, there are two ways management can make it much easier, in fact, almost automatic, for a union to form and be recognized. The first is by management signing a so-called neutrality agreement. This agreement muzzles managers from saying anything at all about union organizing efforts, and often results in the union being the only source of information about the unionization process and its ramifications. You can imagine what effect this has on both the information that workers receive and the sentiments they have about their employer. The second way that management can pave the way to unionization is by agreeing to a card check process. Once a card check process has been agreed to, Elections are unnecessary. Instead, once a union has collected enough authorization cards, such as the one in the bottom right of your screen, the union is automatically recognized. Because no secret ballot is involved, a card check process is rife with opportunities for intimidation and influence. Importantly, an organization can't be forced to sign a neutrality agreement or adhere to a card check process, and Paul had no desire to agree to either of these mechanisms. This brings us to our first lesson, which is crucial in all negotiations. Know your interests. While Paul wanted to prevent unionization at Beth Israel, he understood the pivotal tactic to achieving that strategy was to agree to neither a neutrality agreement nor a card check process. Crucially, Paul also understood that negotiating directly with the SEIU would likely worsen the situation. Something we often ask our clients to consider is if their interest can be, or is likely to be, improved by negotiating in the first place. Just as King Solomon, when asked to divide a baby between two women claiming to be its mother, sometimes meeting in the middle, or splitting the difference, just isn't possible. Paul recognized similar dynamics in his negotiation with the SEIU. Neutrality agreements and card check processes are binary commitments, not amounts that can be haggled back and forth. This negotiation was a bit unusual. In essence, it was really a negotiation about whether to negotiate at all. As Paul saw his and his hospital's interests, the desired outcomes were no neutrality agreement, no card check, and, based on a full and fair debate of the merits, no recognition of a union. The SEIU knew this, and next we'll discuss how they would wield what we at Laxabanius call a corporate negotiation campaign. Corporate campaigns are something we're intimately familiar with at Laxabanius, and have helped clients use them and defend against them to great effect. While they come in many forms, corporate campaigns involve the careful sequencing of many persuasive moments in order to build up to an agreement when immediate direct negotiation is unlikely to reach an attractive deal. So, if the SEIU can't directly force Paul's hand, how will they attempt to influence him? Most effective negotiation strategies use a party map, and here we can see a map of Paul at Beth Israel and get some ideas of the various stakeholders and parties involved in the hospital ecosystem. Importantly, Paul doesn't need to meet with and further legitimize the SEIU. To pressure Paul into agreeing to a neutrality agreement or a card check process, the SEIU would embark on a multi-year corporate negotiation campaign. The SEIU planned to launch a multi-year full-court press to sway people at BIDMC, from workers to the media, regulatory agencies, patients, and even politicians, who they then wanted to in turn pressure Paul to agree to a neutrality agreement and a card check process. The SEIU used outside pressure, attempting to jeopardize relationships between BIDMC or BI leaders and lenders, patients, and politicians. The SEIU also used regulatory pressure to threaten BI with costly action by government agencies and courts, as well as community action and use of news media to damage Beth Israel's public image and ties with community organizations. After persuading these parties, they would then rely on them to place pressure directly on Paul and key BIDMC leaders such as board members and doctors. These folks would eventually surround Paul with the message that he should acquiesce to the SEIU's demands. This is how corporate negotiation campaigns work, and Paul had his work cut out for him as BIDMC resisted the efforts of such a well-executed and what turned out to be 5-year campaign that sought to target any and all of the hospital's supporters in an effort to pressure Paul. We've now arrived at our second lesson. Understand various stakeholders and their pressure points in your negotiation. Paul identified several groups that each deserved consideration and attention in addition to the SEIU itself. Beth Israel's board members, hospital workers and affiliates, the press, politicians, and community groups. Paul's blog was instrumental here because it allowed everyone to be on the same page, and for Paul to make public statements on his own time and terms. Each group had differing needs and concerns, from business interests of board members being threatened to planned disruptions at affiliate hospitals vital to the financial well-being of Beth Israel. Paul's blog let his communication reach transcend traditional, organizational, and media boundaries, something that social media still excels at today. Additionally, by leaving the comment section open on the blog, Paul allowed readers to come together and express their frustrations with the SEIU's campaign, solidifying the resolve of people who otherwise might have acted differently had they been left to weather the SEIU's tactics in isolation. Paul often responded to the comments himself, giving audience members the accurate impression that he was actively listening, that this was a two-way communication, not just him broadcasting his thoughts out to the world. Here's an example of how the blog functioned against one particular action of the SEIU. At one point, the union mailed over 500 letters to doctors at their BI mailboxes to sow discontent among doctors. One doctor shared the letter they received with Paul, who was able to publish a blog post informing his readers that these letters were coming, and he was able to highlight the letters' inaccuracies and biased motives. He was able to do this before most of the letters had even left the mailroom to be delivered. By taking away the element of surprise, Paul significantly blunted the intended effect of the letters. In effect, Paul inoculated the intended audience, preventing them from being swayed by the SEIU's message. None of this would have been successful had Paul failed to be proactive in establishing his blog in the first place. Being proactive is our takeaway number 3. Paul had cultivated his asset of a blog prior to the launch of the SEIU's campaign. The result was a readership over 10,000 strong, including healthcare executives, politicians and regulators, members of the media, and not only Beth Israel staff, but leadership at BIDMC and affiliated hospitals. Paul was able to build significant trust with people through his blog because, again, he was radically transparent about sensitive and difficult topics. This included justifying his personal compensation and discussing really embarrassing and difficult mistakes that were made at the hospital. In contrast, the SEIU's website targeting Beth Israel was clearly created for the sole purpose of this negotiation campaign, and it didn't end up garnering the same readership, trust, or support as Paul's blog. Paul was able to inoculate key stakeholders against the SEIU's campaign by describing precisely what he thought would happen in advance. Paul said the SEIU would make claims of patient mistreatment that BI couldn't comment on because of privacy regulations. And then protesters would come to the hospital with billboards. So when the SEIU arrived, handing out signs and t-shirts proclaiming, "Fire Paul Levy," many key stakeholders, such as doctors and board members, reacted with more amusement than concern. Even members of the press reacted to the SEIU's actions by calling Paul and asking, "Is this part of that campaign you warned us about on your blog? If so, what the SEIU is talking about isn't really news." The result? The SEIU found a much more unified organization and network of stakeholders than they anticipated. The SEIU even found that expected allies, such as members of the media and politicians, were less than helpful, sometimes downright skeptical of the SEIU's claims. Paul's proactive self-audit, coupled with his inoculation of key stakeholders, was successful at reducing the impact of the SEIU's campaign. A general takeaway here regarding social media negotiation: assume you will be attacked on all possible fronts. Self-audit yourself, your organization, and various members of your organization. Remember, no organization is a monolith. So self-audit everyone proactively. And if you wait to build your audience, credibility, and defenses until you're already under attack, it's too late. Paul followed this course of action. An example of an organization that didn't was Amazon when they were selecting their New York headquarters. Finally, effectively mobilizing supporters and neutralizing opponents requires clearly stated values and principles. This was something Paul excelled at. Crucially, Paul didn't anchor his calls to action or reasoning on whether Beth Israel staff should unionize or not, but around more universally accepted concepts of process and fairness. By focusing on democracy and the right to debate, organize, and vote without fear of retaliation or retribution, Paul's blog was able to keep the conversation on message in opposition to the neutrality agreement and card check process over the duration of the SEIU's 5-year corporate campaign. When the SEIU was framed as standing against open, honest debate, free and fair elections, and privacy, it was in a precarious position. Forward progress towards getting a neutrality agreement or a card check process stopped altogether. In conclusion, Paul and his blog were victorious. The SEIU never attempted to collect authorization cards from staff to organize the union. Far from being pressured by the board to cave to the SEIU's demands, Paul was given one of the Fire Paul Levy shirts during a board meeting as a lighthearted joke and a thank you for his hard work. Additionally, this was a significant setback for the SEIU with massive ramifications. In addition to significant reassignments and demotions within the union, the SEIU failed to advance its national card check legislation in Congress, despite a newly elected President Obama and a friendly Democratic Congress. Some legislators on Capitol Hill even cited Paul's blog and his experience with the SEIU as a reason that legislators didn't want to advance the SEIU's proposal to even a committee vote, much less a vote on the floor of the House. Of course, this episode occurred in the earliest days of social media, but we find its core lessons still have currency today. To recap: 1. Know the full set of your real interests in a potential negotiation. 2. In advance, understand the full set of your stakeholders and their pressure points. 3. Be proactive. In this case, and more broadly, establishing and building credibility with a wide audience in advance is critical. Social media is the best place to do this. Finally, 4. Frame your persuasive efforts in terms of your principles and values. In this case, Paul was committed to free and fair debate without intimidation over the merits of unionizing the workforce at the hospital. Consistently returning to those values was absolutely crucial to his consistent success in pushing back on the SEIU's tactics and demands. Now that we know how Paul and his personal blog managed to go up against the SEIU and win a multi-year corporate negotiation campaign, I'd like to invite Paul into the discussion and open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Isaac, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. I just wanted to add a couple of things to the points that Isaac has made, and then we'll be happy to take questions. First of all, I just sent a note out on the chat saying that I've posted a compendium of all 5 years of those blog posts related to this corporate campaign on a website, and please feel free to flip through that at your leisure. Secondly, I just wanted to mention that conducting a campaign like this through a blog is an intensely personal effort. It has the strengths that Isaac mentioned, in that I could be quickly responsive to people's concerns and anticipate things that were coming up. But it also tended to personalize the fight as one between me and the SEIU, which was in fact part of their purpose. And in writing the blog myself, it amplified that approach on their part. That's good news because it makes it more effective. The bad news is if you end up losing, it's probably a career ending or at least a job ending step in your life, because it is so personal. With that, I think we should turn to questions, Isaac and Jim and David, and from the audience. You're on mute, Jim. And David, you're both on mute.
David, you're muted.
Thank you. So a couple of good questions here. First, I think Paul, and then I'll ask Jim to speak to the same question. First question is, when you open blogs for open comment, are there any tips on how to manage potentially difficult comments? I'm sure we've all seen what happens on the bottom of YouTube videos. You said, when could such an open communication strategy backlash? Moreover, I'm seeing more and more CEOs getting involved in political topics like climate change, Black Lives Matter. Where's the fine line? What's the risk of backlash? So the question is, backlash, what's the risk, and then how do you manage that?
Well, that's a matter of personal decision. I actually addressed a number of public policy issues on my blog that I thought might be of interest to my readers. And which gets to your next question: how do you handle comments that come in? I handled them directly. If they involved bad language, I wouldn't permit them to go up. I would moderate them out. But anything else was fair game, in my view. And as you look through those blog posts, I think you'll find that the level of the discussion that occurred was really quite excellent. And even though I permitted anonymous comments, people tended to focus on the issues. And when they didn't, other posters would say things to them like, "Why are you wasting our time here?" So it was a self-rewarding kind of approach. Jim, you had thoughts on that too?
I think that the experience of a lot of CEOs in getting involved in political issues or sensitive issues or related to their organization, but directly communicating, does require some moderation of the comments, because a tactic can be to flood the comments with bad faith, partisan stuff that really doesn't advance the conversation. But as long as they're questions that are reasonable and otherwise, I think a direct approach is really effective. I would note that looking over your blog, it was pretty clear that many PR departments and legal affairs folks from the general counsel's office might have winced when they saw how frank you were about different things. And I think that while there may have been some risk in that department, that the gain in credibility that you were talking straight and frankly was large.
Jim, you raise a good point. In fact, my press department and my legal department did not get to see my blog posts until they were up. And sometimes reporters would call my press secretary saying, "What did Paul mean by what he put on the blog today?" And my press secretary would say, "Oh, what did he put on the blog today?" because she hadn't yet seen it. And so now also recognize I was not running a publicly traded corporation where you have all kinds of SEC requirements and so on. As Elon Musk has learned on Twitter, you've got to be somewhat careful when you're in that situation and say something regarding the valuation of your company. But I was generally familiar with the rules and regulations and also just tried to keep things polite and interesting.
Okay. So second question. How long did it take Paul to get such a large audience on his blog?
It took a while. I was helped by Chris Rowland at the Boston Globe, who was a reporter at the time, who actually wrote a story about the fact that I had started the blog. Before that, I would go to Google like any other self-respecting blogger and do a search on my blog and get virtually no response because no one was reading it. But once Rowland wrote that story, all of a sudden people started reading it. He also said to me, "Hey, this is a little boring. Could you make it a little bit more provocative?" And that was actually good advice. But it took, I'd say it took about 2 years to the point that there was full readership. And, for those of us who've done blogs, you don't do that just by writing your blog. You also post on other people's blogs and you cross-reference and you list their blogs on your blog so that readership is shared in that way. And one of your goals, I know this sounds self-serving, but one of your goals is to increase readership. I mean, you're spending all this time writing. Presumably you think you have something interesting for people to read, and unless they're reading it, it's the proverbial tree falling in the forest.
Okay.
But this is a sometimes bloggers are looking for a big general audience. And while that's a good thing, or was a good thing for you, Paul, I think it was critical to have the hospital staff, the doctors, the residents, the staff, the board, the donors, and so forth, that those stakeholders could be pretty easily targeted and induced to follow this because it was keen interest. And they really mattered in this campaign because those were many of the pressure points. And so there was a targeted audience as well as a general audience that perhaps some bloggers that are more kind of broadcast oriented wouldn't have.
Well, and also, Jim, there's a cascading effect. So for example, a lot of the people who worked in the hospital didn't follow the blog per se, but they were friends of mine on Facebook. And how did that come to be? Well, every week we would do an employee orientation for new employees. And I would say to the new staff members, hey, friend me on Facebook. And so then when a blog post came up on the blog itself, it would link to Facebook. And those people who might not always read the blog on their own would be notified of a new post.
Okay, so there are a number of questions I'm going to combine here that notice a couple of things. One is that this was in the early days of social media when blogging was the thing, or one of the early things, but now there are many other platforms, and so and social media has evolved. And the question is, how have things changed, and since then, and do these lessons still hold true?
I think the lessons still hold true. The approach obviously has to adjust to change circumstances. My sense is that today most people wouldn't be reading the kind of blog I have on the regular basis that they did, but they are reading things on Facebook, and certainly, as we see, they're reading things on Twitter. By the way, at the time I was doing this and I had been on Facebook, as mentioned, a colleague out in the industry said to me, you should really get on Twitter. And I said, what is that? And so I started and then got hooked, and I wrote to him to complain, and he said, you need to understand that Facebook is the gateway drug that leads to the crack that is Twitter. And and today there are so many other platforms, and as Jim was mentioning, there are also a full panoply of analytic tools that can use the data that's available on all those platforms. So focus on the ones that are relevant to your audiences.
One change. Go ahead, Isaac.
Oh, sorry, David. I think one thing to just add on this is that social media has become a lot more sophisticated, right? So you can use really advanced analytics and targeting to put your message in front of very specific people, but also the key lessons remain the same. And I think the thing that you should think about in social media as you approach it is that being genuine and authentic matters a lot. And that was part of the appeal of social media in the early days, right? So in 2005, when Paul is telling folks to get on, to friend him on Facebook, Facebook had fewer than 2 million users, right? And so that was viewed as a genuine connection. So we certainly follow social media profiles today that some of them just look like they're built by a legal team or a PR team. But there are other pages that have much higher levels of engagement, and customers or followers really enjoy engaging with and seeing in their newsfeed or in their life because they have that authenticity. And so I think the degree to which, whatever the channel is, right, whether it's Twitter, whether it's TikTok, the degree to which you can genuinely connect with an audience and not just even if you're broadcasting out and not necessarily looking to create a two-way dialogue, being in an environment where you're being authentic and connecting, right? It's the difference between seeing my bookcase behind me right here and seeing like a Zoom background of a beach. Like, you're pretty confident I'm not on a beach. And seeing my bookcase behind me actually is like, oh, like this is the situation that we're all living in today. It's an authentic display of what we're actually experiencing.
But Isaac, it does give the impression that you may have read those books, and we don't know if that's true, right? So,
right.
Which gets to another question, David, I just want to pick up. Someone has asked, where do you draw the boundaries when it comes to the personal nature of this blog, and how do I avoid claims of gaslighting and manipulation? Well, at the time, nobody even knew what gaslighting was. That's how far back this was. But to your point, this was my personal blog. It was not an official, so to speak, vehicle of the hospital. But frankly, how do you separate the CEO of an organization from the organization? You can't. And so, although I was speaking for myself, it was presumed to be speaking for the hospital. But on the gaslighting and manipulation, I think that the best way to deal with that is to be very open to the kinds of comments and criticisms you get, whether on Twitter or a blog or wherever else, whatever forum, and just answer them directly and honestly. People may not agree with you. They may not even appreciate your point of view, but I think they tend to appreciate the fact that it's your point of view, that it's not being moderated by a PR department or a legal department, that it's happening in real time. I mean, people would post, I would respond. And sometimes they would find mistakes that I made. And I would say, thank you for pointing out that mistake. And I would immediately modify the posts, thanking the person by name for pointing out the mistake. So it was, when Jim talks about radical transparency, this is part of what was going on.
Right. So, I mean, one thing to say back to, you know, how has social media evolved? Probably two things. One is speed, that, you know, things are moving at a much faster speed and on many platforms, not just one. And second, in some of those platforms, you may not be able to moderate as well as you were able to on a blog. So I think somebody asked here, you know, given that there are a lot of alternatives today, which are the most effective and how do you draw the readers you want? It was just maybe the $64,000 question of marketing, but
well, I think it is. I think that's a very case specific and institution and personal specific question. You have to, as Isaac was saying, you have to figure out first what your underlying interests are. In the case of an opponent, it's important to understand what their underlying interests are and how they are likely to achieve those objectives. Then we have to figure out who are the parties who are going to be involved in this negotiation, call it a meta negotiation, or non-negotiation, as in this case. Who are the parties? What are their interests? How will they respond to various arguments, facts, lack of facts, and so on? I think the thing we learned in the Amazon case, which was striking, was that there was a very small group of people who were not even interested in the headquarters battle per se, who were intervening in that battle. Why? Because they were concerned about Amazon's policy with regard to immigration, right? Wasn't that the case, Jim? And David, I'm pretty sure.
Selling facial recognition software to ICE, I think was the issue.
And so they used this particular issue to get at Amazon. So this takes a certain amount of rigor and analytical work and sophistication. There's a lot to think about here. You can't just start posting a blog and say, well, everyone's going to read this and life will be good. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah,
the Amazon case happened in, much more recently than the hospital case that we looked at today. But when you think about it, the core questions of how do you influence, how do you mobilize supporters, how do you neutralize opponents? There were ways for Amazon to do that without a blog, but by listening actively, by connecting with supporters, and essentially having them make the case in a decentralized way, offering to meet the concerns or to address and negotiate the concerns, rather than standing back with this kind of decide, announce, defend. We'll just let the merits of the case and the value of what we're offering New York really suffice as an element of persuasion. And what we saw is that just wasn't enough. You couldn't develop the same kind of reputation and direct readership that Paul had, but there are 1,000 ways that one could have intervened to mobilize supporters such that that level of support which was there and the genuine concerns which were raised by their headquarters could have been addressed in a negotiation rather than a kind of a take it or leave it situation, which Amazon eventually just left.
So here's a question. I don't know that we're the best person to answer at least part of it. One is, how was social media treated legally? Could opponents use your writing against you? And there's sort of not legally and legally. I think probably not legally we're able to talk about. Legally, I'm not sure. Paul, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, when you go out on social media, putting aside legal issues of defamation and the like, and by the way, anyone writing should just be alert to, except if you don't want to do it this way, to good manners and just prudent behavior and the lack of ad hominem attacks and so on. You do, in the US, you have First Amendment rights. You can say almost anything about anybody, but that doesn't mean you should. But in terms of statements made, theoretically, if we were involved in litigation at our hospital, anything I might have said on the blog could have been cited by a litigant in a court. Frankly, I don't think there was anything I ever said there that would be probative of anything in terms of a legal case. But you have to understand that what you say publicly is public and can be used. The same holds, by the way, for an interview with a reporter, whether on mainstream media or internet kind of media. It doesn't matter. Whatever you say is out there. So you have to make a choice as to whether you want to be out there, because everything you say is public.
Okay. Is there anything that this is addressed to Paul, but that you would do differently or not repeat again? So if you could go back to the beginning, would you do it differently? I'm sure there is something, but.
Well, with regard to the SEIU, it was pretty much, it was very effective. There might have been little things that I would have changed in the language, but truthfully, not much. And I think the most important aspects of this whole thing were one, that it was essential that I not engage in personal negotiations with the SEIU for the reasons Isaac talked about. First, it would legitimize their role. Second, those conversations, based on what I saw in Yale New Haven and elsewhere, would not remain confidential. And in fact, the SEIU would reinterpret what had happened in the conversations in the public domain, thereby clouding the message and making it confusing for your own employees. So that was a very, very important decision not to negotiate. Second important decision was that we had a copy of their playbook that had been released in litigation elsewhere. And there was also a book written about their approach. And we had a really good sense of what they would do next. And so I could print, here's what I expect them to do next, and then they would do it. And what was striking is that they just kept following the playbook. They were not adjusting their strategy at all, which is really striking. And a question just came in saying, if you were giving advice to the SEIU, how should they more effectively handled and preempted your efforts? Well, they might have adjusted their playbook so they wouldn't have been so predictable. And for whatever reason, they chose not to, which I think might have something to do with the fact that the person leading the campaign was later found himself without a job after 5 years of failed efforts. The other thing the SEIU did very interestingly is that they never really engaged our workers. Their whole organizing campaign was based on the idea of getting card check or neutrality agreement, and going through all the time and effort of actually getting to know the workers was viewed by them, frankly, as a waste of time. And I think that was a strategic error on their part, because by engaging the workers, they could have found other areas of discontent in our hospital. There are always areas of discontent, and they could have built on those and created more of an internal constituency. So that's kind of a long answer to the question, but overall, I was quite pleased with the way it went. I will tell you that it was a personal, very personal battle over the 5 years. There were many personal attacks on me by them. Not only during those 5 years, but afterwards. And so as I said before, you really want to be careful before you dive into this kind of effort.
Okay, so I think we can wrap up with a couple of things. Last question will be, and I think we've touched on this, but I'll just rephrase it. How should companies make use of these lessons today in a hyper digital world? So, what's your advice for leaders in similar positions today?
I think, Jim, on this one, I would turn it over to you, because I think you've thought broadly about that.
Well, I think if we look at these two cases that we've examined in detail, rather than just talking about the uses in general, they tell you a number of things. And some of them are just classic negotiation lessons. You really need to know what your interests are in the situation. And you really need to know in advance, especially in a world of social media. Back then, this was true, and it's true even more now. What in almost any negotiation that is at all in the public eye or might get into the public eye, where are you likely to be attacked? In the language of, in military language, where are your attack surfaces? If you're a hospital, you can bet that there's going to be some staff discontent. There are going to be some patient mistakes that are widely publicized. There are going to be donors. There are going to be a series of people that are unhappy. And you can bet that some of the attacks will come on those areas. And so anticipating it and being able to preempt it or inoculate against it really makes a difference. If we think of Amazon, given all the areas of controversy about Amazon, whether it's contracts with ICE or whether it's a concern with unionization policies and being perceived as anti-union, being accused of driving out small and local and regional businesses, of coming into a place and driving up rents and so forth. You can just list the issues on which you're likely to be attacked, quite separate from the issue that may actually be at hand. And I think that can be done with a variety of social media tools. At the time, I think that was less critical for a smaller scale kind of Boston area negotiation, but I think that's a key piece of it. Classically, you need to know who your opponents are, your counterparts, and understand their playbook. And looking at their history, you can learn a lot about how people tend to operate this way. Now, the SEIU made that particularly easy because not just their playbook, which had come out in discovery in a legal case, but there were a number of other corporate campaigns that people had written up, and you could say, oh, here's what they're likely to do. How should I counter that? And I think you can find things like that out on social media very easily, and that prepares you for going forward. And then sometimes you can have a direct communication in the way that Paul did, but many times the most effective persuasion in a negotiation where their stakeholders, who may be influential on the people who are directly at the table, is to find the people who are actual or potential supporters, arm them with good messages, let them directly and credibly deal with their audiences, and thereby build up enough support that either counteracts moves of the union, or if they're irreducible negatives, that can that really overwhelm with superior force. I think that's what probably would have been the case. It was so striking in the Amazon case that after the fact, where Amazon was understood to be anti-union and all these other things, that the governor, the mayor, all sorts of civic organizations, unions, and others begged them to come back. There was a deal to be had that by dint of being standoffish and not doing the things that could have happened with social media, really was a negative. By contrast, Paul learned, he influenced effectively, he mobilized supporters and neutralized detractors. And those are the classic functions of social media. It was a different social media world then, but those functions are available now, but they've got to be adapted to the social media and tools that are here. So I hope that's helpful. We're gonna, next week look at it, or rather in our next of these webinars, look at another case, a very small scale case, not much in any broader public eye, and see how those tools could have been used there as well. Let me turn it over back to David.
Yeah, so I just wanted to thank everybody. Make one point, which is many years ago, I was studying persuasion and the social psychology of persuasion, which led me to the social psychology of propaganda. And one of the things that I learned there was something which Paul illustrated here, which is the importance of inoculating your audience against counter arguments. We'll probably see that occasionally in dealing with things like how the presidential elections are likely to turn out. In general, it's important to note what Paul did. One of the steps was to inoculate against counter arguments that he knew would be coming, or arguments that he knew would be coming. Now, as Jim said, we're on the 24th of September, same time, same place, Zoom. We're going to do our third case in this series, which is smaller and local and not even regionally prominent. and more in close. And we're going to look at some different tools for working at negotiations in close. So in summary, we want to thank you for joining us. We hope you found it useful. Please, we got a lot of interesting emails from people afterwards, so please feel free to contact us. We are now doing this as part of our negotiation practice at Lax Sibelius, including sort of looking at the attack surfaces. So how do we protect how do we find out where our clients are vulnerable before the negotiation occurs, and how do we build up proactively to be prepared? So we're finding this to be extremely powerful, not only conceptually, but practically as we advise clients. In any case, we look forward to seeing you. We hope you'll join us again on the 24th for the next installation in social media and negotiation.